CHS. My name is Dan Messer. I'm the campus caretaker. I'd like to turn it over to Rock County Historic Breweries, Bars, and Saloons.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I'd like to start by thanking everyone to find the time out of their busy schedules to come down and learn a little bit about Janesville's history. This is very informal, and we normally would go through this. The normal pacing for this is to go over the presentation and then go for a quick walk over at the brewery itself for a tour. But we're going to kind of flip it up because the sun's going to be setting. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over some basics so you can kind of visualize what it was like down there, and then we'll all walk across the street there if you want to be part of the tour. Maybe take 15-20 minutes and then come back and then get into all the cool artifacts, because this is more about just talking about items. We put a lot of research and stories behind each of those items downstairs. And there's some pretty good and pretty funny stories that have occurred over Janesville over the years that offer great insight into how a lot of those artifacts were used. Now, before I get too far ahead, I have to introduce the rest of my team because I always forget things, and Renee here keeps me honest. Renee, she works at the library, and in this, as you'll learn, our effort here is like a little band of history nerds. And I'm kind of the guy. I actually am retired Air Force, work for Homeland Security now for another 4 years, 10 months, 2 weeks, and I retire. And then I come up here once or twice a year, and I spend all my leave up here working at the site. And I bounce a lot of things off Renee, because she knows pretty much everybody in the city of Janesville. And I have a lot of good ideas, and we call her the brains of the operation, because she kind of keeps me in check in the sense of that, hey, you may want to think this through before you go through it. So Renee is a huge asset with that. And the other one is the guy who does the vast majority of the digging over there. That's Michael Palmer. I think some of you know him already. I'm not exaggerating when I say he has done over 90% of the digging and the actual uncovering of these foundations. And he creates these very big piles, and then we have donors that come in and they bring in their big excavators and their dump trucks, and they take it over to the landfill for us. But Michael's a huge part of that.
He's a real badger.
He is. If he had his way, he'd be digging there 24/7, and I'm not exaggerating. And I would like to say, again, very informal. If you have questions, just raise your hand at any point in time. All right? So, any questions up front? What am I forgetting? Oh, Ashton, come on in. Here's the fourth member of our team. That's all right. It happens. This is Ashton Pelsu. He joined our team about a year ago. And he is, I would argue, Janesville's youngest collector of Janesville stuff. And he's going to talk at the end of the presentation about some of the things he's uncovered that not all are brewery related, but they're very, very interesting things. So, and there's a few other folks we have on the team. It's constantly growing. So when you get down to the brewery, we're going to be standing in what was this area right in here. And what we're going to do is talk about each of the different sections of the brewery, very basically. And if we start the tour from going from south to north. So for visualization purposes, the kiln is where they would dry the barley before they would put it into the brew house, which was in the middle here. Underneath this office building were cellars and tunnels, which I'll talk about, and I have them depicted on slides as well. Behind there, you'll see a big rectangular piece, a second one to the east. That is where the malt house was, and that's where they would actually soak the grains. And once they were nice and plump, they would go ahead and take them and spread them out on a floor until they germinated. Then they would take them to the kiln. All the ingredients would be put together in the brew house in the middle here. And there's only 2 photos of the brewery that we have. This one here you're looking at is about 1900. And the difference between the two is the gabled roofs, and the brewery extends further to the north. Because about 1892, everything from the left of the brew house was added by Louis Knipp. And they added a huge fermentation cellar, which meant they no longer needed the cellars. They could seal those up, but they're still there. And then they added some engine rooms. And then at the very end, you can't see it on the slide, though, at the very left would be the bottling house, where they would actually bottle the beer. So that's in a nutshell the visualization of what it is we'll be talking about. And the tour is only going to take about 15 minutes. I would encourage you to come back, because you can walk down and around all that if you want. But I know we're kind of racing against the sun here. Any questions again?
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned the engine room. Engine is power the equipment, is it a boiler?
Yes, so what you have, and there's two very large boiler rooms that are still there. One is very ornate, and you could actually see where the boiler would sit on top of a bricks, and they would feed coal into it, and then heat the water, and that would power the brewery. The engine rooms on the south, or excuse me, on the north, the very north, those were added again after the 1890s. The original engine room is in this area here with the chimney, and that thing fell 3 stories down in 1904, and we're pretty sure it's still there. We're finding clues. The newspaper article said Frank Croak was just going to leave it there, but and we've seen some clues here recently that you can see that there's big pieces of boiler with mounts and everything there.
So is all of this then documented in the Gazette?
Yes.
Wow.
So when the brewery was originally constructed in 1857, it burned in 1873, and they rebuilt it. And the Gazette did a great, very detailed article discussing how it was laid out, how the ingredients flowed around the brewery and from the top to the bottom. Because again, everything was manpower here, and they wouldn't want to harness gravity as much as they could. And then over the years, they would talk about, hey, they're putting in a new bottling house. So we'd get some more details on that and incorporate it. There's a ton of what I call grunt work, many, many hours late at night, sifting through newspapers, copying, pasting things, putting in PowerPoint. So I have all the artifacts, or the historical documentation to kind of match with the artifacts. So if that's okay, what we'll do is, unless there are other questions, we'll head down and we can just slowly make our way over across to the brewery in the front there. No big hurry, we can take our time. And then I'll talk about the first half of the brewery to here, and then Michael will talk about the second half. So again, we're standing in the middle of the brew house, which is kind of the center of the brewery. Everything from the brew house to the south would be original to 1857. Now, when the brewery burned down, obviously they used a lot of the same underground structures, and a lot of the concrete you see after Prohibition, Frank Croak poured, by today's dollars, about $500,000 to modernize it. So you do see some of the new concrete mixed in with the old limestone. But the way the process worked, and I'm going back to mainly 1857, is you have a road that extends around down here. And that is a road that the horse and wagons would come in with their barley and their hops. And they would take it to the Malt House, which is the second rectangular room closest to the river down there. And that's where they would unload it. And they would take it up to the second floor, put it in those giant wooden tanks, fill them with water, and let the barley get plump with water. And then at a certain point, they have a certain way they do a test with it. They'd know it's full enough. They would then empty the tank. Of course, all the water, all the waste would go into the Rock River. And then they would lay it out on a floor, and they would rake it until it started to germinate. And at that point, they would move it to the kiln, which is a square building. You see the square foundation at the very end to the right. And that was 2 stories, and that's where they would actually dry it out. And the longer they dried it, the darker the barley would be and the darker the type of beer they would produce. From there, it would make its way back to the brew house, to the second floor above ground, and that's when they would add the barley to the water, and they would make and other ingredients, and they would make what was called wort. And then when the wort was done, they would strain all that out and they'd keep the liquid. But all of those barley remnants would then be shoved down that pipe, which you see sticking out of the back there. All the spent grains would go down there into a waiting horse and wagon, and that feed would be then sold to farmers to their cattle or pigs or whatever type of livestock. I originally thought that was just a trash chute, but someone who was far more smarter than I on breweries kind of corrected me on that. And I was like, I never thought of that. So from there, the brew would then be cooked in a big copper kettle up on the second floor. And then it would be pumped down into this area here, where this area to my right is where the office was, but below there is the original fermentation cellar. And that's where the beer would go to sit after they added the yeast. Now, there's several sets of underground structures here. One of them is kind of right where I'm standing. There's about a 20-foot by 20-foot room underneath me. And the entranceway, you can see a big chunk of concrete. I don't know if you can quite see it on the other side. It's kind of blocking that entranceway. You know, again, I'd encourage you to come down again on like a weekend when you got some sun and you can walk around down there. That goes into here, and we've talked to literally hundreds of people who've been in that room in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even as early as the 90s. So this is one room. The two underground tunnels, when they opened up the new brewery and it was all brick, it wasn't wooden, they described two 250-foot tunnels, one of which started kind of right where Renee's headed, and it goes all the way across the street to just before the sign for the parking for the Palmer complex, just across the street. And that, of course, is where they would store the beer. They're about 15 feet wide, 250 feet long, and that's where they'd store the beer. There was also another tunnel that ran 250 feet to the south, somewhere around here. Now, in 2018, we had folks from UW Whitewater come by with a ground penetrating radar. So we confirmed exactly where it's at. We know, and it's not connected in any way to the Tallman House. It's not part of the Underground Railroad or anything like that. Those were closed about the time the fermentation cellar would have opened because they wouldn't have needed them anymore. And one guy who had been in the actual tunnel said it goes back about 60 feet and it's sealed. We're hoping one day to be able to get in there, and you never know what's back there. They would use those areas for storage. This cellar here is just full of dirt and debris. And if you look at the very bottom, you can see how the concrete of the brew house is kind of collapsing. That suggests that there's probably a big cellar underneath there. And if you come closer towards me, just in the brew house, there's another cellar there that Michael found about 4 months ago, and that one's is filled with debris. You'll see an archway here just to the right of the blue barrel. If you look down there, you'll see the beginnings of a large archway. So that ground goes all the way down about another 8 feet from the top of that archway. And it's a very impressive archway. It's very, very wide. So we've still got another 8 to 10 feet to dig down there. Or I should let me rephrase that. Michael still has another 8 to 10 feet to dig down there.
I just tomorrow if Rob let me.
Robert, where did the chimney fall?
So the chimney, so the engine, there's an orange piece. I'm going to stand right, come out of the way here a little bit. The engine room, the original engine room started right where this piece of orange tape is, and it went maybe, I think it's 14 feet over to the right. How far back, we're not sure, but that big piece of concrete that's there now, if you look at the bottom, you can see bolts sticking out of it. That suggests that in some way, shape, or form, it either held the boiler or the engine. And when it fell in, the watchman opened the door at 4:30 in the morning. There's a great Gazette article on it. You walk into a room, you know sometimes something doesn't feel right. He looks down and he couldn't see anything. So he finally got a light on, and sure enough, the engine had gone down. He got Frank Croak, who lived right on Washington Street, right across from Washington Park. I think it's 424 Washington Street. Frank came over and said, well, there's nothing we can do about this now. We're just going to let it sit down there because, it's a very massive engine. So we're hoping that the engine and its 6-foot flywheel are still down there. And that'd be great. Because as Michael's going to talk about, there's an ammonia condenser over here, and there's a slot for an 8-foot flywheel that would fit right in there. So if we could ever get that one out of here and maybe put it over there, it'd be just cool to have that perspective of it.
Who built the engine?
Well, we don't know. The engine we don't know for sure.
I found a plate from a machine called Berghofer and Lipinski, which was a steam engine manufacturer, but we're not sure who made this engine.
So if the engine's down there, odds are there's a plate there.
Yeah.
And one of the artifacts we had is a copy of a plate that somebody found in the Rock River just down here from the bottle cleaning machine. So and we have a plate from the bottle capping machine Michael's going to talk about in the presentation. And so we get these clues, and they're fascinating because you can go back and you can find the old books, the American Brewer's Journal, I think they called it, and they have all the equipment that they used to have right there, so you can find out specifically by serial number what it looked like. Yes?
Any future plans to excavate this area?
We'd like to. We'd like to dig in. But the reality is we're already dealing with some problems with vandalism. For some reason, 2 months ago, somebody had a deck emergency and had to cut on the far fence over there. You can see how the wood looks really nice. They decided to cut all that wood out and take it with them. And anytime you open something up, you have to be able to seal it right away so nobody can get in. This entire area was nothing but buckthorn and debris. And it had a lot of homelessness and a lot of drug abuse. Most of that is no longer a case here, because especially on the trail where a lot of people are walking by. But the thing is we have to get permission. and we want to make sure that we stay within those limits, but it would be great if we could access them, seal them, and then on perhaps special occasions, people could actually go in and stand in these tunnels that were safely, that were part of our Janesville's history.
So basically what you're saying, all the power is basically steam power.
Yep, all of it. Until, all of it till the very end. And most of the equipment was removed before they raised the brewery. We think it was 1940, they pretty much just pushed it all towards the river. They took the equipment out and pushed it all towards the river.
Was the railroad the same railroad then?
Yes, so 1887, they called this the Evansville Cut. And Anson Rogers was the owner at the time. He made a handsome killing selling this tract of land in front of him. And there were several tracks. I think only one ran straight through like it does today. But where I'm standing now was a track, and it's impossible to kind of visualize what this area used to look like. But all this shrubbery and stuff over here, that's all 12 feet of fill. This was all flat. River Street ran right through this parking lot, right up through here. And on the other side, where this big mound is, it was flat, and that's where the several coal companies, J.F. Spoon was one of them, and Life's Coal was the last one that was there. And the coal, we know they got coal from Life's because when they went bankrupt, they had to sue them to get the remaining balance from the Croaks. So, and that coal barn ran 200 feet down. We have a picture you'll see in the presentation. It's a huge, but the train cars would pull up with the coal. And this track actually goes into the woods, and you can see where the spur would terminate because you got the 3 big foam poles in the ground there blocking it. So.
Where did you get the actual water for the brewing?
Any guesses? No. Everything would go into the river, all right? And then also get the ice out of the river. The original ice house was down, it's behind this big brush pile. There was a huge ice house, and every year they would harvest the ice. And they would bring it up from the river and store it. All of the ingredients, whenever they were brewing, was dumped into the river, but the actual source for the brewing water was a 600-foot well. And the reason we know that is they were talking about putting a well in at the roundhouse, and they referenced the fact that they had to dig 600 feet down to get the water for the brewery. So it was not the Rock River water in the beer. It was pure, and the water is the most important ingredient for beer. You got bad water, I don't care what you put in there, you're not going to cover it up. So, and we were blessed with some great water sources.
So was the river used for transport or anything of any?
So, good question. So last year, Renee and I were up to Fulton. We're trying to incorporate this to reflect Rock County, not just Janesville. And we ran into, there's a church, I think it's Pastor Bob, I think was his name. And I was outside taking pictures of the church, and he said, hey, excuse me, can I help you? And we explained what we were doing. And he had a number of historical clippings and artifacts, or not artifacts, but documentation. And one of the things he referenced was how the Janesville brewers would bring their beer up on a boat to Fulton, but they were a little bit, what would the right way of describing it? They didn't really welcome it with open arms because they wanted to be more responsible. So they actually had them turn the boats around and come back. But yes, I guarantee you there was both. The river also was a critical element for entertainment. So the first brewer was John Buob, his brother Michael, and then later the Croaks would own it. They all owned property. The Croaks would go to Crystal Springs, they would rent boats, and they would bring people up there on a picnic. The Croaks would get a cut of the sales of the boat, and they would sell Croaks beer up there at Crystal Springs. Just across, when you're going into Riverside Park, there's a very beautiful house right before, across the river, before it rises up, and you see it's covered with trees. It's a gray house. That was called Buob's Grove, and that's where they would have big picnics there. But the boats, I mean, think about it. You didn't have a car to hop into or the internet to go surf, so picnics, events were a critical part of the social fabric of the city. And the brewers played a role in it, and the boat livery was just on the other side of the railroad bridge there. They had 2 of them, one on each side. And they would hop on the boats, and it was a big event.
And also take them up to Riverside Park.
Yeah, I can't say, Chautauqua Park, I think is what they would call it, and that's at the very beginning entrance of Riverside Park. So yeah, Chautauqua. If I say it 5 times, I'll get it. So yeah, I mean, this was really an important part, and all these events were covered in the newspaper. The firemen had to get together, the church social, the Germans would have a lot of beer festivals, of course, because that's what Germans did. But okay, I'm gonna turn this over to Michael. I've got to change microphones here, and he's gonna talk about the other half of the brewery that was really from 1892 on.
So as Rob kind of mentioned, after they didn't need the cellars anymore, they had the new kind of technology, refrigeration. So this was an ammonia condenser room. This was added on around 1892. And you can see these very large bolts sticking up. And those were what held a ammonia compressor. So we went to the threshery a couple weeks ago, and we figured out a large ammonia compressor sat here, which made the ammonia for the condensers that sat on the top floor. And those were like big refrigeration units to cool down in the fermentation cellar. So this big opening in the floor there, we weren't sure what it was originally, but we figured out that that's where a large flywheel went. You had the steam engine on this side, and then the ammonia compressor over there, and it was a connected unit. So you had the flywheel in the middle, and it's pretty neat to be able to figure stuff like that out. And maybe if we find the engine, we could put it here, you know, that would be pretty neat. So lots of different history that is really neat to figure out over time as you keep uncovering more different things. It's pretty cool. So then over to your left, you have the original boiler room, which was added on at the same time as this. So it's really interesting to see this, because you got the brick floor, and then inside where the stairs are was the part where the coal would be shoved into the actual furnace part. And I found a couple furnace grates that they actually are very heavy, 90 pounds a square foot. Very large grates that you would shake, and the ash would fall down, but the coal would stay burning. They were made by the Martin Grate Company, and that's where the brick encasement is back there. That's where those sat. So as we were uncovering it, it's just interesting to see all the different, how it was made. You have a ductwork over there that the air would be pushed in for circulation. The brick floor, you got the coal clean-out door, and then like I said earlier, the other boiler room where Renee is. We're not sure exactly how that one was laid out. It's a little different than this one, but most likely the boiler sat on top of those 4 cement pillars. And then here is, we're not sure exactly what it is. So there's no actual map or image that shows this. So it's most likely some kind of a passageway from the trail down there that was a lot lower originally. You actually have about 15 to 18 feet of fill, which is mostly burned coal, boilers and stuff. But it was kind of neat. On the corner right here, there's 2 initials, EA. So possibly that was the name of the person who poured the concrete or something. And this was most likely done in the 30s, so we might try to figure out what kind of concrete companies there were back in that time frame and figure out what it could have been. So we think that little pillar thing right there was probably the chimney. They had a 60-foot chimney above the roof. So somebody pointed that out and said that's probably what that was. And then over to your left is the bottling house. And we can walk down there again, but by the red picnic table, I'm going to be talking a little bit about it later in the presentation. There's actually an indentation in the concrete. And that was where the bottle capping machine sat. So it was really interesting to figure that out, and you can see how the different rooms were laid out, where the brown picnic table is there. There's a room that could have been like an office, or maybe where the bottle cleaning machine sat, because sometimes those would be in a separate room for sanitary reasons. So back there you can see on the edge is a large pile of glass. So I mentioned earlier that the hill was a lot lower than it is now. And if you ever look at the sign up there, there's an image taken from the gas company across the river, and you can see the ground level is a lot lower. You have a trail coming up to the back of the bottling house, and then it goes down to the north. So we've dug down a little bit here, back here, and it's just solid glass pretty much. They just smashed all their bottles during Prohibition, and they didn't need them. So you find once in a while a sort of complete one, but they're pretty much all just broken bottles. And so that's what that glass is. And then you got the slag over there, which is coal, burned coal, and it's just changed so much over the course of how many years they were in operation. It's just so interesting. Then to the very north, over in that grassy field over there, was a house. And that house moved 3 times over the course of, they kept expanding the building, so they moved the house a bunch of times. So that was right over there, and there's a map or a aerial image from, I think, the 1980s or 90s of that from the above, and you can see where the foundation of that house was. So it's pretty neat, and that was also owned by the brewers, so they would a lot of times live nearby or on the site of the brewery complex. So it's pretty neat to figure that out. Yeah, I can show that thing.
What was the purpose of the house moving? Was there any?
Yeah, they just kind of, the house moved just because it was originally where the ammonia condenser room was, and then they added that on in 92. They moved it again right around where that middle slab is.
Sure.
And then they added this on, so they moved it again. So it was kind of, you know, inconvenient, but
Necessity.
yeah. So do you want to add anything to that?
I think we're, any questions on this second half for Michael? I think we'll head back over and then to get to the fun stuff. But again, come down here when you got some time and walk around. The easiest way to get down there is go down the original road. Bit of a drop off here. And one last interesting fact, at one time, this was entirely level. In other words, behind the brewery is really far down and over here is really far down. All this is fill, and you're literally standing, especially in the back, on tens of thousands of pieces of broken bottles. We think it happened during Prohibition, and they filled it all in and built a new brew house on top.
I got one last question. Okay, what would they use for the, you know, the boiling water? Okay, would they use some of the brine from the beer or?
I don't think so. I would think there'd be too many chemicals and stuff in there. They probably just used the pure water from the spring would be my guess.
Okay, because I was thinking, you know, because I work for a company, you know, they use an additive, you know, why not, you know, some of the warp, you know, as
I wouldn't think so. I mean, they could, but I would think they would just use the water from the below. All right, so we can make our way back over and then we'll get some cool stories going. So this is kind of the what we'll go over. I've already taken care of the tour. So again, anytime you have questions, just ask, please. So these are the folks that have really made this possible. I mean, the way the story about how this began was I was kind of getting into breweries in 2014. Janesville's history just fascinated me. And I ran into Dennis James, the president of the Rock County chapter of the Ice Age Trail, in the parking lot. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to the old brewery." And this is when the entire site was completely overgrown and you could only see a few things. You could see the walls in the back, but you couldn't see any of those foundations or anything. Again, they're under 3-4 feet of debris. And Dennis was like, "Oh yeah." He says, "I heard there was a brewery here." And I'm like, "Yeah, one day I want to get it uncovered." So they were the first folks, the volunteers from the Ice Age Trail, to start clearing the brush. And that took about 4 to 5 years. This is before Michael came along. And we old folks work at a slower pace. So the Ice Age Trail has been a huge partner in this. The city of Janesville, it's city property. We meet with them every time we're here to get the permissions to stay within our left and right limits. The Historical Society has opened up a lot of the, they have some artifacts, some kegs and trays that they were kind enough to let us photograph. Copperhead Contracting was the first company that came in to clear out about half of the large fermentation cellar to the left. This is before we had a fence around it all, so we wanted to make sure that we kept some debris there in case somebody fell down, they wouldn't hit concrete. Fred Gray, he's hosted several fundraisers over at his brewery for us. He's a huge supporter. Al McKnight, he's the guy with the big equipment that would come in and clear it out. He's done that for us twice. And again, if it wasn't for the folks to come in and move the stuff, you'd be looking at these massive piles. That's all you'd see, and it'd be very confusing to everyone. Eric Richards has made 2 trips. He had a smaller skid loader, was able to get a lot of the piles that Michael first built, erected out of there. Gary Mooney made a gracious donation, and this really helped us because last year, of course, with the supply chain crisis and the cost of wood for lumber for the fences, it skyrocketed. And Bob Cooklaser, he has the neatest little machine, and he spends a fair amount of time down there. He can maneuver that machine inside smaller locations to get where others couldn't. So that's just a huge help because he can take a lot of that dirt from the piles Michael creates and then move it to a central collection point. So when I say it's a team effort, it really is. It's just, I'm kind of the guy with the vision, big picture thing, and then between Renee, Michael, Bob, and others, they just pitch in and we all make it happen. So here's the actual core of the group. I think you've met most of them. I'll go from left to right. You got Renee, that really good looking guy named Rob. Ashton's right there. Brent and Jolene Meglick and Brent DeReamer, he's a sheriff's deputy. They are probably best known for getting a lot of bottles out of the Rock River, literally thousands of them. And they have an amazing collection. It is something to behold. And that's their son Gunner on the right. And this is, you can see, it already looks quite different at that boiler. You can see a lot more bricks were up there at the time. We had to take a lot of those out. So now I'm going to give you a brief history of like the who's who for the brewery. And this map here is about 1857. And it shows, so you got the two bridges starting at the bottom. You've got the Court Street Bridge, and you go up to the Milwaukee Street Bridge. Then you've got this big body of water to the left. It's called the Race. And that would channel the water behind the river to power the mills, the wood mills, the flour mills, and other businesses that needed power. North of that, you had what we call the Centerway Dam. 4th Street is actually Centerway. That bridge wasn't installed for quite a few years later. And then you had the Chicago Northwestern, or Milwaukee-St. Paul Railroad spanning the Rock River. And then just above that, you can see the Croft near the top left, and that building right below the F, we think was the brewery. And the Tallman House was there at the same time. Both of these structures were built around the same time frame. So I guarantee you that, in the morning when Mr. Rogers or Mr. Buab would go to brew the beer, he could look over and see the Tallman House, and Mr. Tallman could see them. But this is a fascinating map. We get these images and we touch them up to try to make them as accurate and fill in, because sometimes there's big holes missing in these maps, so we try to make them as accurate as possible. This is an 1867 map. Bruce Monson, when I first started this, my dad, who knows a lot of the bar scene, and he's retired GM, he said, hey, you need to talk to this guy named Bruce Monson. And Bruce had this map stashed away. It's the only copy we've seen, and we've donated a copy to the library. This is just a portion of it. But what's outlined in yellow is the original brewery, and it's the only image we have of it. It's a 2-story wooden brewery. And when that was destroyed in a fire, they chalked up to being a case of arson. They heard a noise in the middle of the night. The gate was opening up to the brewery. Somebody was across the street, heard the gate open, and then 10 minutes later the thing had burned down. Never solved. But we think the long building would have possibly been an ice house on the southern end of that image. And the entire map, though, is really incredible because it has blow-ups of other buildings, and another brewery, the south side at the time, was John Rothinger. It's a great image of that. So I'd encourage you to check out the Janesville room in the library. There's a lot of fascinating books and maps. I mentioned the Tallman House. Of course, William Tallman was a kind of a teetotaler, wasn't a big believer in beer, alcohol in general. So I have no doubt that as they were looking at each other every day, they weren't too happy because here he's got this beer factory right across the street, and if you brew beer, it smells. And I'm sure that just irked Mr. Tallman every day.
You should have bought the property.
Yes, he should have. I bet he was regretting it once he realized, oh, great, I got a beer company moving in next door. Abraham Lincoln, I wish I could say that, yeah, he had a beer from over there, but I was talking to my dad, and he said Abe Lincoln was a big fan of rye whiskey, so it's highly unlikely that he had anything to do with the brewery, other than perhaps seeing it. But I would like to think if he did have a beer at his time here, maybe, just maybe, he had it from the north side. The original owner was Anson Rogers. He made a lot of money in shipping, in grains, along the different rivers. And he settled in Janesville, and he became he was the mayor at one point of Janesville, very successful businessman, didn't know anything about brewing beer. And he had an interesting political background. He was a member of the Copperhead Party during the Civil War, which thought that the war itself was unjust, and they were cast by many as being Southern sympathizers. But somehow, he managed to survive that and became a political operative. He went to the Democratic National Convention. He was very, very active in politics. And he lived well into his 80s before he passed. He didn't know anything about beer, but John Buab, the gentleman on the left of this photo, and his younger brother Michael, 22 years his junior, they were the brewing experts. They came over from Switzerland, and they had the background. They settled, I think, originally in Jefferson County, and then made their way over here. And so he was the original brewer from 1857 till around 1882. And there may have been a gap in there. We haven't quite confirmed it, but he may have gone back to Jefferson briefly. Now, you'll see the Buabin brothers. This one is advertised for River Street opposite Mineral Point. That's the brewery. But they also operated the Southside Brewery, which is right near the ice arena and the Wisconsin National Guard building. And in 2019, those were the cellars that the city let us get into. One of them we had to collapse because it was falling apart, but the other one, it's sealed, it's intact. The ends are ruined, but the structure itself is good. So we're hoping one day, when I win the lottery, we can do something with that. There's the location of the fire that had started when it destroyed. And right after the fire occurred, Anson Rogers said, hey, we're going to rebuild this and we're going to make it fireproof by using the Cream City brick that made Milwaukee famous. So, and the short story on that is it was a special kind of clay that when it was fired, it would make it it turned out this cream color. And a lot of buildings in downtown Janesville still have that. And it's that's why Milwaukee's called Cream City. So he built that. In less than a year, the brewery was back up and running. And it only suffered a few small fires after that, nothing catastrophic. This is a slice of another sketch taken from 1877 called Looking Down the River. At the very bottom, opposite the river, that steamboat is where the brewery was. Of course, these aren't always extremely accurate, but you can see where the brewery was there at the foot of Mineral Point. Again, you see the dam, there's no bridge going across Centerway, and you can also see the race. Now, as years would go by, more and more buildings went over the race, so it almost would look in some photos like there's no water flowing underneath there, but there was.
What year is this, man?
1877.
Where's the Tallman House?
Tallman House would be right here.
Oh, sure.
Right here. I always think it's neat when you look at these. You didn't have all these invasive species of plants growing, and you would just have open views with trees. You know, nowadays you got just stuff growing every which way.
So it looks like there is a bit of a drop-off
Yes.
by this, so it wasn't
Always.
flat out like beach?
No, it was always a drop-off. Always a drop-off. And when they would harvest the ice, they would have a no-kidding ice run. And they would use this thing called a windlass, which is the same type of machine that would bring up an anchor on a ship to actually bring the ice up. But yeah, it's always been a drop there. Although it doesn't show it here, Traxler Park was actually, there was actually like a creek that flowed through it. And that's all landfill. That's all. Anytime a tree blows over in a big storm, run down there and take a look at the roots, because I guarantee you there's bottles in there. So all that's fill. All that's fill. This is what the original rebuilt brewery looked like. Remember the first picture had the gabled roofs. The kiln is still there on the south, the office, the malt house, the fermentation cellar, brew house. There was an ice house at the northern end that was torn down in around 1890, and they made that into the fermentation cellar. And that poor house there, that house was moved 2 times further north. As the brewery expanded, they had to move the house. And it was occupied almost certain by a brewery worker there.
So the kiln that's kind of like a cooker.
Yep. You have the fire in the bottom, and you would have these ceramic tiles on top, and you would spread it out there. And I mean, think about that. Here you are, you know, May, June. They would typically stop brewing in July, August because it was just too hot. But I mean, that's some backbreaking work, keeping those fires going. You know, you'd want to use maybe wood for the barley. You wouldn't want the coal smell getting in there. But again, all that wood's got to be brought in. It's got to be split. You got to keep it going. You got to keep it at a certain temperature. You got to move it around. Then you got to transport it. I mean, this is some backbreaking work. And this is a picture that we used, the only one we have really that shows the entire brewery. Still owned by, it was called Janesville City Brewery. Louis F. Knipp owned it during this time frame. Chris?
How many people were employed often?
I'd say between 7 and 12. 7 and 12, yeah. And they put out a lot of beer. I mean, they were pretty high production rates. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head barrels. We do have the numbers for post-Prohibition from 33 to 39 as far as the amount of beer they produced. I think they were up to over 8,000 barrels at their peak, but we're not sure beforehand. I have to search other records for that. So what happened is Anson Rogers passed. Louis Knipp was leasing the brewery from him because John Buab had moved on. So when he bought it, he right away began expanding it, and that's why this picture looks quite different. You can almost see this would be your brew house right here, and this would be the little ice house. He's got like an animal pen up there or something. I don't know what that is. And then one of the engine rooms is to the left because he's got 2 engines running. You got the big smokestack, and when that engine fell through, they took that smokestack down a few years later. And of course, the train in the picture is not to scale. So he ran the brewery till 1903. He lived right over here on Chatham, I think is the way you pronounce the street. In the old age, he began slowing down. He had a brother that went to Indianapolis and started a brewery with someone else. He ended up selling it to Frank and William Croak. Again, Frank lived on Washington Street. William Croak lived right where the hospital is now. On Mineral Point, there were several big mansions. He had a nice mansion there. And they operated until 1919 when they had to stop because Prohibition was right around the corner. That's when they passed the amendment, and they had a year to end brewing. So a lot of brewers stopped brewing before the actual date it kicked in January 2020, or 1920, excuse me. So by 1919, they were done brewing. And after Prohibition in 1933, this is where your big breweries had expanded, and they essentially flooded the market. You could load rail cars with beer, you had refrigeration, mass production. So all across America, at one point in the late 1800s, you had over 4,000 breweries across America. By the 1970s, you had less than 80. And those were kind of like the dark days. You didn't have a whole lot of choice. It was what it was.
A lot of smaller breweries are popping up all over.
Now they are, yeah. But yeah, that didn't start really until the late 80s, early 90s, where people started. Jimmy Carter, one of the great things he did is he made it legal to brew home beer. And that kind of got things going. It's maybe the only thing he did really good. But no, that kind of kicked that off. And then I think out in Seattle, the microbreweries started popping up. And then now you have all these different takes on brewing, and it's just fascinating. I don't know how to brew beer. I would like to do it one day, but I'm so busy with this stuff. This is a 1937 aerial image that shows the brewery next to the river, and then the Life is Coal yard opposite. And again, all that terrain was relatively flat once upon a time. And you only see one train track running north, but there were other spurs there, as evidenced by that earlier picture of the brewery where you had, I counted 4 different sets of tracks right there. So in 1939, I think their production dropped to like 80 some odd barrels of beer. And the end the writing was on the wall. He declared bankruptcy. I went up to the Historical Society. They have records for 3 of Janesville's breweries, and they actually have the articles of dissolution. I was able to scan all those in, and they had several lawsuits. And the sad thing about Frank, he contributed a lot to the community. He was involved in Riverside Park. He was involved in festivals, picnics. But when the brewery fell on hard times, so did he. And again, he put over $500,000 of today's money trying to modernize a brewery. It didn't work out, so he lived kind of destitute towards the end. I'd ask you to remember a couple things in this picture on the left. One is a little guy he's with, and this is taken at the brewery. And the second thing would be the glass in the back, the window in the back. Just keep that in mind. And if you're ever trying to figure out if you're looking at something Croaks, is it pre-Prohibition or post-Prohibition? If it says Bower City Beverage, it's post-pro, because in 1925, that's when they incorporated Bower City Beverage Company. So any labels or any type of documentation that have on there means it's definitely after Prohibition.
When did Francis pass away, or is he still alive?
No, it's a boy. And I was very fortunate. There was a gentleman here at the last presentation. His name was Tim Holian. He's been researching a lot of Cincinnati breweries, and he's at UW Wisconsin now. And he had tracked him down right before I was getting ready to go back in 2018. And he said, hey, I interviewed him, and you may want to talk to him. So I spoke with his wife, Judith, and they were kind enough to invite me up to the house, and I brought all this documentation with me. And we spent about 2 hours talking. Most family members know very little about the brewery. They may know someone was involved with it, but the details. And unfortunately, I'd say about a year and a half later, he had passed. But I was happy that Judith was like, look, this was really special. He was talking about, there was a big fire. He remembers as being a kid. There was I think it was the Woolworths fire in 1940s. He remembers he lived on Racine Street, and he could see the fire, the flames burning on the Milwaukee Street, opposite the Milwaukee Street Bridge, where the Woolworths used to be located, or the Riverside Fitness Center used to be, I think was the last thing there. So that's really the most rewarding part of this. Is I met another family member, Vic Croak. I was down in Texas doing my DHS work, and I've been trying to get a hold of him for a year, and we hadn't been able to connect on Facebook, and right 2 weeks before I'm ready to leave to come back to DC, he calls me. And so I was able to hop in a car and drive up and interview him, and he, again, he didn't know a whole lot, but he had some great stories about Janesville, and he passed within a year and a half of that. So we're fortunate to have these share this information and document that history, because as the saying goes, every time a person dies, it's like a library burns, because all those stories are gone.
That previous picture, I think Michael may have told me that the window it is in the old Croak House at 424.
Yeah, it's one of the things we have some pictures coming up. Michael's what do you call it? What's the word? A preview, given a spoiler alert.
It says that he's a native of Croak Settlement.
Yes.
There is a Croak Cemetery.
Yep.
On 104.
Yeah, Renee actually went over there because we find this stuff, and her and I kind of geek out. So she made a field trip up to the cemetery and took a number of photos. And we've been walking multiple graveyards, cemeteries, and we find the descendants. And
it's on 104, just outside of Evansville.
By Magnolia Bluff Park.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is on Croak Road.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
there last time.
Yeah.
And I think the first Croak over was Francis King Croak, and he was in charge of the settlement. I mean, his name is referenced a lot. Here's a wider view of the area that shows the brewery and Life is Co. right across from the railroad tracks. But there's some interesting things there. Swimming was popular at Traxler Park. They had a beach house there. You had a lagoon opposite the brewery, and today there's buildings lined up all over there. Opposite, just to the west of the coal barn there, all that now is occupied by Mercy Hospital, but there were houses all throughout there. And I have a friend, Bill Trop. He lived on the house. His house was on Olive and Myrtle, right where they think the emergency room is now, he says. So, and we capture those stories. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't realize there was a brewery there. They knew it was an old bombed out building for all intents and purposes, and they would play down there, but not many people really knew. And the Croaks, a lot of the history wasn't passed down through their family, so we just get little bits and pieces. And this is in 1992, and you can still see the remnants of River Street before they completely sealed it off. And in the big area here is where the Palmer building is now, and it's all a parking lot, but you can see the outline of the foundations of the buildings that used to be there. It's a fascinating slice of Janesville's history, all those buildings. I'm working on some other initiatives, some walking tours. I think we're gonna try to do one Saturday at 9 o'clock through the Ice Age Trail Alliance. We do a walking tour downtown, and we have some old images that show what a lot of the houses used to be down there and how the buildings. It's fascinating. And this is if you overlaid that road today, the roads of yesterday over what you have today, this is what it looks like. The lagoon is filled in, Traxler Park is now complete. I remember houses on the southern part of Traxler Park in the 70s. But yeah.
Is that lagoon then just fill?
Yep, it's all fill.
Wow.
Just like Traxler Park used to be called Goose Island because there was no kidding an island. And again, that's all fill. As Janesville was expanding over the years, every little community had its own dump. And they're all over Janesville. Now, most of them today have been built on, but yeah, there's just dumps all over.
Shooters or something, right? Where the lagoon is? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a CrossFit company there. I think I drove by. Yeah.
Yeah, there were a couple of houses right over by the park. I think John and Ben Graff.
Yeah, Benji. Yeah, Ben Graff. Yeah. He introduced himself to me, and he was explaining all that to me, and he found some old beer labels at the brewery. He used to hang out there all the time. So if you overlaid, and this is an image from 2010, well before we started cutting any trees down, but this is what it would look like from above. It's a combination of maps of 1884 and 1915. So these maps, when I say the ones that show the diagrams, those are the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And they were a company that would go around every city and make these massive volumes. They were usually about 3 feet high by 2 feet wide pages. And they documented the buildings for insurance purposes. So if a building had burned down, the insurance company would know roughly how much the building was worth to pay it out. And this is a drone image taken a couple of years ago. The orange fence is where the ammonia condenser fence is up now, and it shows part of the fermentation cellar that's been cleaned out with still debris on the ends, and you can see the bottling house, and you can see some piles of debris there. The bottling house that we started the tour at is right here, and you can see it's complete fill, but thanks to Michael, it is no more.
There's like whole trees in there.
Yeah. I've had some before and after pictures. I'm an old guy, and I was hurting trying to cut down somebody's trees and lug them out of there. And the city, we put them in big piles. The city comes by and picks them up. And all the volunteers that were helping, you know, fortunately, no one's been hurt. Michael threw a brick and it hit him on the head. I think that's the only injury we have had.
During the Prohibition, did they ever sell some the dry malt?
They did not, no. But it was very common to have it sold around other businesses in Janesville. Because all you need is a malt to make the beer with the other ingredients. So Ashton actually going to talk about a malt company. I won't steal his thunder. He'll talk about that. They were down on West Milwaukee Street. So yeah, I've been doing a whole bunch of research on Prohibition, and really from the beginning, I think the way you can best summarize how Prohibition became a law. Somebody coined the phrase, the politicians who voted for it vote as they prayed, not as they actually were. They wanted, they didn't want alcohol, but it was so much part of it was ingrained in our society that it was doomed from the start. And it cost billions of dollars and created the mob and all these other things, or it hastened their arrival. So yeah, and I'm working on a Prohibition presentation in December at the Lark. So I'm finding out who was all selling alcohol illegally in Janesville at different saloons and so on and so forth. So now to the relics, and they're in 3 different categories as they were laid out on the tables down there. One talks about buildings in general from this time frame, the other are beer-related artifacts, and the last thing are personal effects. And Michael and I are going to tag team this. So the first one, pretty much talked quite a bit about that, the coal yard. That's a piece of coal. And again, coal-powered America. And as technology is improving, obviously, coal and fossil fuels are slowly leaving behind. I just read today in the paper that they invented a new battery for cars that's can be recycled 10,000 times and lasts 20 times longer than existing car batteries. So technology is moving forward, and it was critical to what we did before as a nation, but it's being left behind. And coal heated not only the buildings, but also if you see old houses in Janesville, you look at the bottom where the limestone is, you'll see a chute where they would actually dump the coal in for people to heat during the winter. Number of coal dealers throughout Janesville, throughout the U.S. And here's a map. This one here shows J.F. Spoon Company, what they look like looking across from the brewery. And you can see there's several different spurs, train spurs running there. And this is when Knipp owned it. Again, see how close River Street is to the railroad tracks? I mean, it was right up there. And life was coal. They switched to oil in the later years, but in the 1970s, early 80s, they went out of business. I was able to connect Earl Schultz. He was a gentleman who was down there in the green shirt when we first arrived. He put me in touch with Richard Leifus, who's retired out in California, and he sent me this photo. And in the background, you can see the brew house, the gabled roof of the brew house, and just above this coal sign where it says coal would be the kiln chimney. And again, it's a very large, successful company, but again, as times change, just like delivering ice to people's refrigerators to keep the contents cold, it faded away. All right, now we're going to ask some questions. Bits and pieces of different relics are down there. Would anybody have any clue as to what this could possibly be? There's an important clue.
Door plate?
Yes. It's part of a door unit. Again, we research all this stuff out to try to be as accurate as possible. We think it looks something like you see on the left, because you got the same keyhole kind of set up there, and you have the circle. So we think it was from the Acorn Company, because there's another relic that was up there. It's on the upper right-hand corner. That was another type of lock, but the company that made that lock also made the lower one, and we think it was from that same company out of Chicago. And they're still in the business today, believe it or not. All right, this one I think you guys probably get quite quickly. That's from the glass, the window. And as Michael had mentioned to some of you earlier, There's his house at 424 Washington Street, and on each side you can see that very same glass pattern. And this is very common in several houses in that area. But I was really excited. I want to say it was 2017. I found some of that glass. I knew exactly what it was. It was like, oh, this is great. You know, I mean, it's just, so to most people, it's just, you know, doesn't mean anything, but it's kind of a connection to history.
He gets connected to stuff.
Yeah, you do. You get an emotional attachment to it. You know, I have far less space in my house to store stuff than Michael does, and it's always a challenge when we're going through stuff. I say, Matthew, you want to keep this or throw it away? And sometimes it's difficult to get him to throw it away. And I'm like, it really is junk. So that little guy in the first picture with next to Frank Croak, this was Francis when I got to meet him, and that was him in the photo. So that was very special. He had the photo on the left on his table in his living room, and it was just
5 or 6 in
yes. As soon as they showed me the picture, I said, I've got glass from that window. I was like, it was very exciting, and that's about the only relic they have. They have a few labels and a couple bottles and some caps, but that's all. He actually ended up moving in his teen years up to Racine, and I think him and there's another, Paul Croak, very successful lawyers in the state, very successful. All right, I got a funny story behind this one here. Anybody, any ideas? Trap. When you got barley and hops and other stuff, you're going to have these rodents. All right, so that was rodent control. Now, I'd like to always preface this story in that I'm just reporting what I've been able to uncover. I'm not saying what was true and wasn't true. I'm just reporting what was covered. So on that trap, you have a name tag. And on that name tag is Carl Tuscher in his address at 486 Pearl Street. And I found this in the fermentation cellar just one evening. I wasn't digging per se. I was like, let me kill 20 minutes, and I find this trap. And I took it home to my dad, and I said, hey, Pops, I found this rat trap with Carl Tuscher. And he was drinking a beer, he about spit it out. He's like, Carl Tuscher, what's he doing down there at the brewery? And we couldn't figure it out. And Dad said, well, Carl can usually be found at bogeys, like not every day, but pretty much every other day, between like 11 and 1. And he said he drives a black car, so if you drive by bogeys at that time frame, you see a black car, go in there and confirm it's Carl. So I had looked for him for several weeks. I was almost stalking the poor guy. And one day, there's the black car. So I walk into bogeys, he's sitting there at the corner of the bar, and I was like, Carl, I said, my name is Rob. I'm like, you don't know me, but I think I know a little bit about you. And I said, is this your trap? And he said, yeah. He said, we would actually trap for muskrats and animals down there after the brewery was closed. I did find another trap that was older. I was able to date it with the gentleman's information. That was actually when the brewery was in operation. But he said he had just gone down there and hunt animals. But the thing Carl is best known for, I think, in Janesville history, is he was involved in a suspected DUI while he was operating an excavator, involved in a 7-mile-an-hour chase with the Janesville Police Department through the city of Janesville, that Carl mistakenly believed that if he made it to a church, they couldn't arrest him. And that did not work out that way. He got out of the thing, according to the story, he said, you can't arrest me, I'm on a church, and the police department was not quite the way it's going to be. So Carl was arrested. I know the name, they do a lot of auto body painting. Their name is still big around town, so I'm just hoping that if any of his kids or grandkids hear the story, don't get mad at me and come like beat me up, because I'm just reporting what I know. All right, this is where Michael takes over.
Oops, wrong way. So this is pretty obvious. I mean, you know what it is probably. So it's a pitchfork, and originally we just were thinking, it's just a pitchfork. Why do you use a pitchfork at a brewery? We had no clue. Maybe for hay or something like that. But as Rob was telling me today, he was talking to Earl Schultz, the Iceman, and he said that they would actually put hay on top of the ice to keep it cool. And this was found, we found a couple of these, and one was actually found near where the Ice House Foundation is. So that's very possible of what that could have been used for.
So when you find these, Michael, when you're digging through and it's like you hit something hard and it's like, oh, this is something.
I pretty much like dig. I have a certain way I dig. It's like weird, but I dig down, and a lot of times I'll just throw something in and see it in the ground and it's like, oh, there's something. But I also have like little hand diggers that I dig around and a lot of times find different things. So
Do you use your metal detector?
I do a little bit. It's not, there's just so much metal stuff there that it's hard to discriminate it, yeah, but also you're digging it down anyways, so it's going to be found most likely. So there's a image of it, what it would have looked like all there.
What happens when you find articles like this?
Artifacts, we document them, take pictures of them, and Rob's building out a large-scale, really high-tech website that everything will be labeled on there, so it's really neat, all the different artifacts. So how about these? What do you think these were used for?
Tincture.
Yeah. So you had lots of different things in a brewery, like kettles, lots of different metal tubs, different things. Roofing, we found lots of weird shapes of roofing metal. So lots of different things these could have been used for. It's really cool. Any guesses on what this is? You can notice the shape. You can see on the bottom and top, it's got a little screw hole, and you would have had something over the front of it. Yeah, very close. So, so it's actually one of those lights that you would pull down. So I want to say this was found by the Kiln. There was a lot of different things by the Kiln, different things like this, weird items like this that you wouldn't really suspect to be there. Lots of interesting things.
So you would find like some kind of identifying mark on the piece and then research what it would, like a similar piece?
Yeah, so some of these things, like one in a couple more slides, you know, I was researching the bottle capping machine and came across an article from another thing, and it's like, oh wow, I had no clue this was what this was. It's like you just start researching something and you see another thing, and it's like, wow, that's what that was. So, well, if I can get it to move. So if you got a fence or something, you probably got one of these. We found just tons of different styles of hinges, different shapes, sizes, lots of doors and windows that would have opened, so you had to have lots of hinges. So, and probably electrical people know what these are. Yeah. So there's an image here. So you can see how they were kind of laid out in the walls and the joists. You had the knobs that the wire wrapped around or went through, and then the tubes where the wire actually went through. And these kind of phased out in the 1930s. They were kind of, yeah, fire hazard, yes. Started around the 1880s. So you can still see these. One of the houses Rob went in for over on the South Side Brewery that was owned by John or Michael Buob still has the remnants of the original electrical in it. So it's pretty neat finding this kind of stuff. How about this one? Yeah. So I think of it either as a coal shovel or a big poop scooper shovel. It could even be something Ashton mentioned. He thought it was like a wagon handle or something. So it could be anything like that, really. So you'd have lots of coal, different things like that you'd have to shovel in. So those were 10 building-related artifacts. The next 10 are related to beer or making of the beer. The first one was really interesting. So there's a couple clues on there that kind of give it away as to what it is. I kind of already talked about it, but what do you think that is?
Machine plate.
Yeah, it's a machine plate off the bottle capping machine. And I mentioned that in the bottling house you saw the base of the machine. Yeah, so originally bottle caps were called crown corks. And this company was founded in 1892 by William Painter in Baltimore, Maryland. And there's a lot of, he patented over 85 items over the course of his lifetime. So there's a lot of different things like the bottle cap, the bottle opener. He patented all of those.
Any remnants, Rob, of this in Baltimore?
Oh, give a minute.
Oh.
Head that way.
So did you find that one in the river or?
That one was actually, there was a big tree stump under where that red picnic table is, and me and muscle man Rob and I, we both pulled it out of there one day and found the machine plate under there. Oh. So that's also a clue as to that's where the machine would have sat. So on the left is an image of Painter. The middle image is a 1892 patent for the bottle cap he invented. And then on the right is the actual machine, and you can see the base of the machine was that same kind of design as where we were looking at the brewery. So on the top of the machine you have the hopper, and that's where the unused bottle caps were stored. They would get fed down the track, and then they would get to what are called crowning heads, and that's what actually comes down and crimps the bottle cap around the lip of the bottle. And this was pretty high tech this was patented in 1897, and it's like very high tech. It could actually cap 90 to 100 bottles per minute. So, I mean, just the technology from all the way back then is just amazing. So you can see just off to the left of the center of the screen is that same machine, and notice how large it is. The machine just to the right is another style of capping machine. That one is only caps one bottle at a time. And they both are kind of operate under the same thing. You can see the belts coming down from the rod up top, and that'll run the flywheel on the back of the machine. And that brings the crowning head down that caps the bottle. The one on the far right is another kind of capping machine, and that was a foot-powered capper. You can see the foot pedal right in the front of the machine, and that works pretty much the same. You step on the pedal and it brings down the crowning head and to cap the bottle. The one on the far left, we're not sure what it is. You can see it's a lot larger than all the rest of them, so we're not sure if it's a capping machine or it's most likely a capping machine because it was an exhibit for the Crown Cork and Seal Company, but we're not totally sure yet. So got some more research to do on that one. So to your question, Tom, so this is on the left is a 1914 image of the building that's in Baltimore of the Crown Cork and Seal Company. The right image is a modern day image of the same building, and that's actually now used as art studios, the Baltimore Design School, and different apartments. So they moved from this building, I want to say in the 20s, to another building in Baltimore that I think is getting turned into something else. I was reading a little bit about it, and the company's actually still in operation all throughout the area now. So if you ever look on the back of your soda can, if you ever see Crown, that's the same company that made the machines. So there's the same base of the machine that you saw earlier, and there's an image of the bottling house there. The yellow outline is where the machine sat, where we were looking earlier, and that's also where we found the plate. So it's kind of interesting to put together where we think each machine would have sat, like the bottle washing machine that Rob will talk about here in a minute. And yeah, it's really neat. So Rob's going to talk about the next one here.
Yeah. So this year, again, another story. Renee research just went out. We found this. We first saw it. We thought it was something electrical, and every now and again, we pass different things around for others to research. And I said, Renee, can you please research it for us? What you can't see on it is on the side. It says Crandall 1515. It's imprinted on there. And Renee went on the internet, did a little bit of searching, and found out it was the company that actually made it, a Crandall company out of Buffalo, was actually still in operation. So she called him up, and I think it was the vice president, picked up the phone, and she said, hey, I got this thing here, and she described it to him, and he's like, yeah, that's our thing, and what that was a counterweight for when they would fill bottles.
What's the dimension on it?
Yeah, it's not.
3 by 3 probably?
Yeah. So that allowed us to do some research that would show the different types, Crandall can filling machine. And then they also, couldn't know what's there. They were, again, very popular, a number of patents, and they continue to exist to this day. Don't know how the machine actually worked, though. We found, I think, we may have 2. I know we have 2, we may have 3. Yeah. So I don't know if there were like a series and the bottle would come in, drop down, and then they'd fill it, and it would automatically shut off. But yeah, that's bad. We really thought it was something electrical, but it turned out to be a bottle filling machine. So every time we find these things, we want to make one day I'll make a road trip up there and talk to them and find out more about their company. All right, this is back to you, Michael.
Switch it back again.
Yeah.
So does anybody know what these are? You probably know.
Give a hint.
No?
Looks like something.
For a beer crate.
Oh, sure.
So those are,
Now I see.
yeah. Oops, that was the wrong one. Here. So you can see here, those are what went around the edge of the crate to hold it together and keep the wood from splitting apart over time. So those are pretty interesting. We found quite a few different sizes and styles of those. So stuff like that's neat to find because it's, you know, it was actually from the brewery, and how many times that crate would have been passed around to different people in the town, you don't know. So this is another interesting one. You got some clues on here again, what it could be.
Shut up. No?
It's actually two different styles of a beer tap. So the one on the left was called the Peerless Beer Tap. It was made by the American Tap and Bush Company. And you can see here is the same piece we found there, and then the top, the one that says Peerless. So I actually bought one off of eBay a couple months ago because I saw one and it's like, oh wow, that's related to the brewery. So it kind of worked. It works very similar to a tap for a steel beer keg today. You have a pump tube up at the top on the left image, and you would pump the air into the keg, which would create a back pressure, and then you would release the valve and it would pump the beer out of the keg. And that little hose nipple that comes out, that was for an air hose to also pump air into the keg. And it was this again was patented in 1895. The company was out of Detroit, the American Tap Bush Company. And they kind of patented I'll show you here, what's called a bung hole down there. Before it was just an open bung hole in the side of the beer keg, and that's where the beer came out of. But they made what's called they call it the Peerless Bush. And the beer tap actually fits into there and it turns. There's two grooves on it that lines up with the bung hole that creates an airtight seal in the tap. So that was kind of a neat thing to find, and we found lots of different styles of these and different pieces. So you can see kind of on the left-hand image of the tap in a beer keg. So that's pretty neat there, of different styles of beer taps. And that other one that was on the first image, we're still researching that one. We're not totally sure exactly what that one was brand-wise yet. Probably know what this one is, some of you? Keg band. Yeah. We find lots of these. I think I have like over 100 of them actually. Find them all over the place. You know, I think they were just shelves, and when they bulldozed it, nobody wanted them. So there's an image on the right of a wooden beer keg. They'd have anywhere from 4 like this one to 8, depending on the size of the keg. You're going to do this one.
Those beer kegs must have been heavy.
Oh, yeah.
Even empty,
Yeah.
but full of beer.
Yeah. Back-breaking work.
They would roll it.
Yep.
You have to have a beer when you're done.
Yeah.
Empty it
Or a
in
cup
a
of
roller.
thirst.
So about 4 years ago, a gentleman, I started the Facebook page to kind of share information about the brewery, and a gentleman hit me up and he said, hey, I found this plate in the river. And he let me have it for a couple of years, and I was able to make a mold of it. And it says exactly what it is. It was a plate to the machine that cleaned the bottles. And that serial number goes right to the one that they sold to the Croak Brewing Company. And Otto Eck was the founder of the company. Again, you had a lot of very ingenious men who would create these specialty lines for bottling, corking, different things, cleaning, filling. And we're pretty sure it looked more like the one on the right, the bottle cleaning machine, and that the bottles would be placed on a rack. They would drop down, and you'd have brushes that would come up with hot water, and they would clean them out, and they'd be able to reuse them. And the company that sold it was out of Philadelphia, but Otto, his machine shop, was out of St. Louis. And I'm sure the building is no longer there today, but that's very much a place we'd like to go see and just find out what's there today. And again, he also came over from Germany. He did a number of different machines, as I mentioned earlier. This is just a quick couple of advertisements for all the things he was involved in. And then again, a lot of these companies were all the way through to the 30s and 40s, and they continue on to this day. So we're not really sure where the machines would have been. We can rule out where the picnic bench was, where the bottle capping machine was. So it could be somewheres, the bottling line could have been somewheres in these highlighted areas in yellow. We've cut off the bolts on the bottling floor foundation so people wouldn't trip on them, but you can still see, as Michael pointed out in the tour, I'm sure, that there's where a lot of these machines were located.
Where would the compressors be?
Don't know. Be honest, don't know. Don't know. We don't have any pictures from inside the brewery whatsoever. The closest we get are the Sanborn maps, and not all of them were to the same detail over the years. There were Sanborn maps in 1884, 1901, 1909, 1915, and the last one was 1925. But interesting enough, even though the brewery was there, they just papered over it in the map like it wasn't there. So they're accurate to a point. All right, this one here, we had quite a few of these on display down there, and this is kind of before you had bottle caps, you had the wiring harness. And this was the first generation of them. Every one of these harnesses had to be made by hand, and every one of these harnesses had to be installed by hand. So it was a very time-consuming process. I'm sure the guys who were doing that were quite good. And these were used primarily on what we call blob top bottles, where you have the big blob on the top. Once you had the crown corks were introduced, the Crown and Seal Cork Company introduced bottle caps. That's where you had the lips on the tops of the bottle, so the crown could grab on. But these were actually just around the blob top. And you would just flip that lower lever wire up to release it, and then you could seal it again. And if you were fancy, we did find one. Renee found a actual porcelain one at the brewery site. It didn't have a label on it. It didn't say, it wasn't painted other than just being the white porcelain. But some of the fancier companies would be able to afford custom logos on there. And the important thing about beer bottles, especially the blob tops, those are made by hand. They cost a lot of money. So they were very important to brewers. You'll see some older bottles will say this bottle not to be sold, because you could buy the contents of the bottle, but you'd have to return the bottle after drinking it to the brewer. And it wouldn't be uncommon for one brewer to come across another brewer's bottle, and they would usually smash the neck of the bottle off, a little extra added cost for them. So, but using another brewer's bottle was pretty high offense, and they took it very seriously. All right, now this one here is pretty much just a bottle cap. You look real hard. Can anybody figure out what brand? It's still in operation today. No. No. It's got red in the center and a gold color outside of it. Miller. Yeah, we think it's a Miller. We cleaned that sucker with acid to try to get it to go to show what it could be. But these show the different types of caps that they had at the Croaks. They brewed a brand called Pride of Wisconsin. When it was brewed for distribution in Wisconsin, it was Pride of the State. But when they exported it, you can't export a beer that's called Pride of the State that's made in Wisconsin to Illinois, so they had to relabel it and made it Pride of Wisconsin. So we mentioned that Louis Knipp ran the brewery from 1882 to 1903. Although he bottled beer and he advertised for it, hey, we have bottled beer. They actually bottled it out of Bodacious Brew. That was a building. Long story on how the bottling industry, where you couldn't bottle it on site. We have yet to see a Knipp bottle that's either embossed or a Knipp label. No one has one. It's like it doesn't exist. So if anyone happens to ever come across one, you will be a very wealthy person. All I would like is a picture of it. This one here. It's not an STP oil can, I can tell you that. It's a beer can. So it's a cone top. Now the first beer can was produced by a company in the Northeast, and the Kruger's Cream Ale was the first beer, and it was a flat top. But the problem is, you've got all these companies with bottle capping machines. And if you introduce a flat can for beer, all those machines are obsolete. So this was kind of the interim from really after Prohibition until the mid 40s, early 50s. And there are actually several different types of cone tops, 4 different types. You really start getting into the details of all this nerdiness. So we're pretty sure that one there would have been the high profile around 1938 timeframe. And we have found, I think, 3 or 4 different kinds of cone tops. Some of them cleaned up nicely. I think the nicest one Michael has is from Old Style. You can actually make out a lot of the colors on. This one was too far gone. All right, this one here is kind of related to the crate. You had the trim on the side for the metal. Well, this one here, any ideas? When you open the crate, you had to have hinges. So those were the hinges on the inside of the crate. And we have a number of those. And then the last 10 we're going to go over are going to be personal effects. And jump in if I'm taking your thunder here. I'm losing where we transition back and forth. These are the things that people actually used in their day-to-day lives. And these are the most fascinating things in many ways. So one of it, the first one here, I know it's kind of shaped like a iron. I think the proper name for this is a trivet. I've learned so much when I've been researching. And that's where you'd put your hot iron after it was heated so it wouldn't burn anything below. This one here we actually just recently solved. It was mounted on a wall. And I thank Earl Schultz for this again, for helping us solve this one here. Any thoughts? Most of these ones you'll see have a base and a straight wire going straight up. And will sit on your desk, a desk of a business. Because when they would get receipts, whoops, they would actually slap the receipt or a bill on there. So we didn't know what it was till last Saturday when Earl explained it to us. And it was like, you know, you're exactly right about that. This one's pretty straightforward, silverware. You see a lot of it, some more ornate than others. I think we have probably about close to 10 pieces of silverware we've uncovered. This one here, we had 2 of these out for display. Any thoughts? They're very small. Shoes, yeah, shoes, very small. There was a shoe company right in the Rock River, and our friends Brent and Jolene, who do all the river searching, find thousands of these, literally thousands of them. And they're leather pieces to shoes. And these were the styles of shoes that were at the time. And again, very common. The other thing you see a lot of are oyster shells with holes punched in them because you had button companies along the river. And this one here's pretty straightforward. It's a teacup. We tried to make sense of what all the writing was, but we couldn't quite figure it out. It wasn't clear enough. Our guess is it looked maybe something like that. And this is where I start to find as I'm doing all this research. If you have an interest in something, there's 20 web pages dedicated to it. And the writing on China is one of them. This one here, all right, this is, I think, a very cool one. And you'll see why in a second. Pipe. All right, now, if you remember earlier, there was a photo of Frank and his grandson Francis, and Frank was smoking a pipe. Not saying it's the same one. We kind of got it, did some research and kind of narrowed it down to this type of style, but it could very well have been one of Frank's pipes. But again, a lot more people smoked back then, so we're not sure. This one here, pretty blue color, part of a plate. They actually had a cheese butter dish is what they called it, and it's a very ornate and a very, very similar style, although we only have a fraction of it. This is pretty cool. Did anybody watch the old Oak Island series that comes on every November? I'm kind of addicted to it. Well, there was an episode there where they found this toy gun, and I think Robbie Rigsdahl, his dad, was one of the guys who was doing the digging, and he actually died in the money pit. And they found a gun, and Robbie was like, "Yeah, this was my gun, from decades ago." Well, they were able to find this gun, and found almost exactly what it looked like back in the 40s. It's very common. I mean, one thing I learned from looking at my dad's old pictures is everybody in the 40s and 50s loved cowboys and Indians and horses, and that damn painted horse was at every kid's birthday party in the 40s and 50s. And then this here, I originally thought, harkening back to the 70s, that when you had roller skates, you had this big metal contraption you'd put on the bottom of your tennis shoes and skate around. However, I don't think it was strong enough to do that. It's more of just a doorknob that was used. This one here. Oh, yeah, that's good. This is where I went into the netherworld of internet research. And I didn't realize that there are so many doll egg collectors out there. And I was just, I'm telling you, it was like a portal into some weirdness. But if you're into it, there's somebody out there who's got, and it was a doll egg. I think Michael said he found some more of these down in the river.
So was there a doll factory here?
No, it's just kids would play with the dolls. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a toy manufacturing company, but. And that wraps up all the artifacts. We got one more special presentation to give.
Where's all the gold coins you dug up?
You don't have any? No coins.
I haven't found any. I found one coin.
Are there any?
But that's it. Everything else is just so much fill. There's really not much coins there.
Were there any questions Any artifacts?
There's a possibility that a lot more of these artifacts are actually in the river then.
Oh, guarantee it. Guarantee it. But the problem is, the current right next to the brewery is very swift. And there are many articles where people fall in the river and they actually drown there. It drops off. Stupidly enough, I threw on a set of waders and walked all along the shoreline, and you literally go out 3 or 4 feet and it goes straight down. And that current is moving. On the other side of the river, it's very slow moving. There's a lot of silt. And when the river drops, you can see it, but it's very, very dangerous down there, and I would not recommend anybody go down and try to, pull anything out of there. It's just very, very dangerous.
What about magnet fishing?
Been there, done that. We've got quite a few things. The problem is there's so many large pieces of metal down there that it gets hung up.
And rocks. They collapsed the brewery and half of it went in the river, so you've got all these rocks that it gets stuck.
Yeah, you'll blow up a bunch of rocks on the river, magnetic rocks. So.
Plus it would only get iron, nothing copper.
Right. Right. So, any other questions on the artifacts? Because I'd like to introduce, again, Janesville's youngest, I think, collector, Ashton Pelsu. He's, 12 years old? When's your birthday?
October.
You're right around the corner, he'll be 13. He'll soon be Janesville's oldest collector. See? Just like that. And what he's going to do is share some just quick 10 items from his personal collection, some of which are beer related, others are not. But we're just thankful that we have guys like Michael and Ashton that are going to continue the tradition, so to speak, so this history doesn't get lost. And Ashton, over to you, sir.
So this was a Badger Drug Company little mirror with like a bunch of little flowers and plants around that side, which there's hops up there, which we definitely like for the brewery. And each flower is a different month. And I don't really know much about this company other than it was on Milwaukee and River Streets.
Where did you find that?
On eBay. That's where a lot of this stuff is from. I do find a lot of stuff in the river too, but I don't think I have any of this stuff on here. So as Rob was saying, that I did have a malt company little mug and opener that was on Milwaukee Street, and it is currently where Crazy Joe's Furniture is. They had 3 different locations, Beloit, Janesville, and Chicago. And they had a short phone number. So this is an interesting croak cap. We've never seen anything like it. This is the only one that any of us have ever seen. And we've seen similar ones, but it was just yellow and like purple. So that's interesting.
It's like a one of a kind.
Yeah.
Very, very rare.
That's just a photo. You don't have that in your collection.
I do have that.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
These things he has.
So was selected, when did they?
That was just our brand.
It was.
It started in 1903, 1904, and they continued it right till the very end in 1939.
Another eBay find?
Mm-hmm.
Have never been put on a bottle?
Yeah, that was an unused one. There's cork on the bottom of it. Yeah.
He had a question too.
Oh.
No, it got answered.
Oh.
It was answered, no worries.
So, what do you guys think the little square on this opener could be used for?
Key?
Close. It was. No. It was for turning on the headlights of an old car before they were automatic.
You don't have that, Tom? Really?
Never seen anything like that.
Well, there's the crown name at the front.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. So that was made by the same Crown Cork and Seal Company.
Wow.
And it's a lion and a bottle opener and croak.
Very cool.
Yeah.
The thing is tiny. When you see it,
Yeah.
you're kind of like, this is it.
Every time on eBay, we always think they're going to be like a lot bigger, and then they're like, oh, that's it. This is a Bua Brothers bottle, which was over there by Croak, as Rob was saying. And as you can see, the top is chopped off. Like he said, people would chop the necks off if they got sent to the wrong place, so they couldn't be used again. And that's like one of the biggest pieces we've ever seen of one of those, especially in the amber color.
It is an interesting piece of history knowing that who would have thought that they'd chop the things off and you've got one. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Is that a river find?
No, I got this from a guy that found it in a dump in Milton.
Wow.
It's from around the 1860s,
Yeah,
70s.
this is an old one.
Wow.
I wish we had the top on to confirm it, but Buam Brothers, they first started over here at the north side, and they reconstituted a decade and some odd later at the south side. But this is a very old bottle and very, very rare. And if it was complete, it would be worth several $100s.
This is a H.M. Hickey soda bottle. I don't really know anything about the company from Janesville, but their brothers had a lot of different soda companies around Wisconsin, and they were all in similar bottles like that. So it's from like 1860s or 70s too. And this is a John Rothinger bottle from 1870s, and it was like in the south side spot as the other Buab, and very rare. I don't think we've seen a piece as big as that. We don't know. He has some interesting stuff about the Rothinger on his Facebook page, which I encourage you guys to check out. And that's about it.
Yeah, this could be one of Janesville's earliest beer bottles, period.
Yeah.
Wow. Rothinger started in 1860. The brewery burned down there 3 times total, twice under him. But I'd be willing to bet that this is the oldest bottle artifact we found from any of Janesville's breweries that we can prove existed. If the bottle didn't have a label or wasn't embossed, it would be speculation. But this is a heck of a find. He got it in a great deal too. So just don't sell this one to anyone.
What, you got a paper route or something? How do you make your money?
This is a Gray & Co. or Gray & Sons. This was an old one from 1860s. It says Arthur Christian right here. It had a stopper in it. When it was full of liquid, it would go to the top and seal it. That was one of their many attempts on trying to find the best way to close a bottle and not have anything come out, which we all have the bottle cap, which we all know and love today. I think it's just neat that we got one of those attempts in our small town. This is a blueprints for the Fisher Body Works, which later became GM. Here's a picture of what it looked like built. That's from 1856. And it's pretty interesting to have that because nobody else really has blueprints from around there. And I think it's cool to have something from one of the biggest car companies in America. And this is a diamond crystal sugar bag from the Rock County Sugar Company. It was located on Delavan Drive. It was founded in 1904. At like the height of the company, they employed around 500 people. It was popular for farmers to work there in the off season of their crops. And the building is still there. It's just currently used as storage. And they closed in 1930s due to the sugarcane industry.
So that wraps up let me grab the mic off here real quick. That wraps up the presentation part. Any questions on anything?
What was with the bottle? You explaining that by filling it, the little stopper would like float to the top. Was that an actual success? Was that?
It works sometimes. That's why they That's why we have the bottle cap now.
It was called the gravitating stopper. Oh.
So you may also see, I went to a beer can show and I found this, they call it a torpedo bottle. The bottom is totally round. And it's totally round. And I was like, what the heck's this for? And they said, well, the intent was you fill it and then you have to put a cork in there, but the cork only to be of use had to stay wet. So you couldn't stand the bottle up, it had to lay on its side, therefore the cork is always wet. So yeah, there are some interesting ways along the inventive path there before William Painter finally solved it.
I'm gonna go set up those items downstairs so you guys can check them out.
Please look at them on the way out. He'll have them on the table.
Explaining that as far as the bottling process, there was or wasn't regulations about bottling?
Okay, so this is very complicated. I'll try to condense it. Brewers always had to give their share of taxes to the federal government. Abraham Lincoln is the first one who started a beer alcohol tax. And when the law first started, they said, especially for brewers, you had to bottle the beer on a different facility across a public street that was in use, separate and distinct from the brewery. You couldn't just, they couldn't just really so much put it across River Street because River Street really wasn't that well used up here. So for the South Side Brewery, they were on either side of Beloit Avenue, which was a main thoroughfare to get to Beloit. So they put their bottling house right across the street. North side didn't have that luxury. Again, you had the coal yard right across there and some others. So they worked a deal to go down to Bodacious Brew. So, and that's that article I had about the bottled beer, the building number, they say, hey, we bottle it out of this facility here. They would have to put the beer in kegs, put the kegs on a wagon, take the wagon down to the house, the bottling house, unload the kegs, because the taxman had to be there when they kegged the beer to get his cut. And then they could repackage it in bottles, bring the kegs back up, clean the kegs out, refill it, do it again, and then the bottles then can be sold throughout. It was a 12-step process, very time-consuming. But Frederick Pabst in the early 1890s finally went to the government and said, look, this just isn't working. And they changed the federal law to allow them on-site, and they could use gauges and pumps and hoses to get them. But the brewers were known to shortchange the taxman, so they had good cause. So that, in the 1890s, all that changed. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this. I hope you learned a little bit about Janesville's history. We'll be having more of these. I'd also like to thank the Historical Society for allowing us this tremendous venue to host it in. So thank you very much.